11 women, one desert, no answer. In February of 2009, a woman walking her dog on Albuquerque's West Mesa made a discovery that would crack open one of the darkest chapters in New Mexico history. At first, it looked like nothing, more than a bone in the dirt, an odd shape sticking out of the desert floor. Easy to overlook, easy to mistake for animal remains. But it wasn't animal. What that woman had found was human. Once police began digging, one body became two, two became five, five became 11. 11 women and the remains of an unborn child, all hidden in shallow graves on a remote stretch of West Mesa overlooking Albuquerque, buried in sand and silence, forgotten by the land until the land gave them back. These were daughters, sisters, mothers, women whose lives had unfolded in the shadows of addiction, poverty, sex work, and neglect. Women who vanished years earlier while the city kept moving. And when they were finally found, the questions only multiplied. Who killed them? Why were they buried there? And how does someone murder so many women without ever facing justice? This is a case that exposed the city's deepest failures and left grieving families waiting for answers from a desert that still refuses to speak. Before this story starts, turning up bones, breaking open old missing persons files, and making all of us side-eye every empty stretch of desert, like, comment, follow, and subscribe. Because around here, mysteries may stay buried for years, but your support doesn't. Welcome back to Haunted in Between. This is Episode 8, The West Mesa Bone Collector. It was February 2nd, 2009. The West Mesa lay quiet under the winter sky. If you've never seen that part of Albuquerque, it can feel almost unreal. Wide, flat, stretches of sandy earth, patches of scrub brush, dry grass, construction roads that seem to lead nowhere, housing develops that never fully became neighborhoods, the kind of place where wind carries dust in long, restless streaks and where distance can fool you. Things always look closer than they are. That afternoon, a woman named Christine Ross was out walking with her dog, Ruka. It was supposed to be a normal walk. A little exercise, fresh air, time to clear her head. Then she saw something strange poking out of the dirt. At first, it didn't scream horror. It didn't look cinematic. It didn't come with ominous music or some dramatic flash of realization. It was just odd. A pale shape jutting from the ground in a place where it didn't belong. Christine bent down and picked it up. It was a bone. Not small either. Large enough to stop her in her tracks. She looked at it, uncertain. It might have been an animal bone. The Mesa wasn't exactly a pristine place. You could find all kinds of things out there. Debris, bones, trash, construction remnants. But this felt different. So she did something smart. She took a picture and sent it to her sister, who worked as a nurse. Her sister's response was immediate and chilling. It looked human. Christine called the police. Within hours, officers were on the scene near 118th Street on Albuquerque's far western edge, an area that had been slated for development before housing crash turned parts of it into a strange in-between zone. Not fully empty, not fully occupied. Just open enough for someone to do terrible things unnoticed. At first, police approached this site carefully, expecting the possibility of a single set of remains. Then they found more, and then more again. As the digging continued, what began as a routine response turned into a forensic excavation of staggering scale. One body, then another, and then another. By the time the recovery operation ended, investigators had uncovered the remains of 11 women and the remains of one unborn child. The West Mesa was no longer just a patch of undeveloped desert. It had become the largest homicide crime scene in Albuquerque history. The recovery site stretched across roughly 100 acres of dry, exposed land. Crime scene investigators, detective, anthropologists, evidence techs, search teams, they all moved carefully across the sand, mapping each find, making each grave, documenting each fragment. The scale alone was overwhelming. This wasn't a single body dumped in the wrong place. This was a pattern, a burial ground. Someone had been returning to this mesa again and again, leaving women in shallow graves just beneath the dirt and brush. And the worst part? They had been there for years. As investigators worked the crime scene, another reality began to settle over the city. These weren't recent killings. These women had disappeared between 2001 and 2005. For years, they had been missing. For years, families had waited. For years, some of them had feared exactly this outcome. Now, the desert was confirming what they had already begun to suspect. A predator had been operating in Albuquerque for a long time, and no one had stopped him. The process of identifying the victims took time. DNA, dental records, missing person reports, interviews with families, case comparisons. Slowly, painfully, the women got their names back, and they were identified as Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Syllannia Edwards, Doreen Marquez, Victoria Romero, Jamie Barela, Evelyn Salazar, Virginia Colvin, Julie Nieto, Cinnamon Elks, and Michelle Valdez. And those names became the human truth beneath the headlines. These were not anonymous remains. These were women with histories, families, habits, voices, and unfinished lives. Many were young, incredibly young. 2 of them were just 15 years old. One of them, Michelle Valdez, was pregnant. Most had lived hard lives marked by addiction, poverty, or sex work. Many had spent time in and around Albuquerque's street-level drug scenes and the corridors along East Central Avenue, a stretch of the cities long associated with prostitution, violence, and neglect. But those facts, while relevant to the investigation, can also become a trap. Because when the public hears substance abuse or sex work, empathy often shrinks. Cases get filed differently in people's minds, urgency softens, blame seeps in, and the women become easier to overlook. That is exactly what this case would force Albuquerque to confront. It's easy in a case like this to get lost in numbers: 11 women, 1 desert, 1 killer. But the number 11 hides the individual heartbreak. Each victim had her own life, her own people, her own absence. Victoria Chavez, 26, was remembered as outgoing and outdoorsy. She liked hiking and camping. She had a life beyond the profile police wrote down. Doreen Marquez was 24 and had children waiting for her. Victoria Romero was described by loved ones as smart, funny, and tough. Michelle Valdez was 22 and pregnant. Her father later remembered how she could light up a room the second she walked into it. Syllannia Edwards was only 15, a runaway from Oklahoma and the only victim from outside of New Mexico. Jamie Barela was also just 15, one of the youngest victims found on the mesa. She disappeared alongside her older cousin, Evelyn Salazar. Think about that for a second. Not just one teenage girl pulled into danger, 2 family members gone together. That alone tells you how broad the predator's reach may have been, or how vulnerable these women were in a city that often did not protect them. And then there's the simple fact that many of the victims were mothers themselves. Children grew up without them. Parents waited for years. Siblings held on fading hope until the desert returned bones instead of answers. When families began receiving confirmation that their missing loved ones had been found on the mesa, it wasn't closure. Not really. It was a shift from uncertainty into a different kind of pain. No longer, where is she? Now, it was, what happened to her? And why didn't anyone stop this sooner? That second question would haunt the city just as much as the murders themselves, because many of these women had been missing for years. Their families had reported them gone. Some relatives had begged police to take their disappearance seriously. And yet, for too long, the women remained on the margins, in the files, in the public mind, and in the way the system prioritized other lives over theirs. The desert kept their bodies, but not their names. And once those names came back, the city had to face what it had failed to see. Long before bones surfaced on the mesa, one detective had already started to feel that something was wrong. Detective Ida Lopez worked missing persons in Albuquerque, and unlike many people in the system, she noticed a pattern. Women were vanishing. Not all from the exact same block, not all on the exact same date, but from the same world. They were mostly young women involved in sex work, drugs, or unstable living situations. Women operating in or around East Central Avenue, a corridor sometimes referred to as the war zone, where vice and desperation mixed under the glow of liquor store signs, motel parking lots, and headlights circling the block. That part of the city had its own economy, its own rhythm, its own rules. And according to people who knew it well, the scene was small enough that regulars recognized each other. Johns, dealers, pimps, street workers, police. Everyone knew the geography. Everyone knew the vulnerabilities, which means the killer probably did too. Detective Lopez kept track of the missing women. She saw what others weren't fully treating as connected. And when the bodies were finally found on the Mesa, those names on her list became the names recovered from the desert. That detail is devastating because it means someone had seen the shape of the danger. And still, the women kept disappearing. This is where the West Mesa case stops being just a serial killer mystery and starts becoming something wider. A story about how systems fail vulnerable people, how some disappearances get treated like emergencies and others get treated like inevitabilities. How predators learn quickly who's absent will cause noise and whose absence will vanish into paperwork. If these women had all been college students from an affluent family, would the patterns have been flagged earlier? Would media pressure have come faster? Would task forces have formed sooner? Those are uncomfortable questions, but the West Mesa murders forced them, because by the time the cities fully grasped what happened, the victims were already years dead. You know what's weird? Most of the stories we tell on Haunted in Between happen in the space where your mind is tired, your guard is down, and things feel just a little off. Late nights, long edits, too much silence. And if you're anything like me, caffeine becomes part of that routine. Here's the thing though, most energy drinks make me feel worse. Jittery, foggy, like my brain's racing but not actually focused, which is ironic when you're trying to tell stories that require focus. That's why I switched to W. W wasn't made by some massive corporation. It was made by a gamer who got sick of the junk. Sugars, dyes, big blends that do nothing but crash you later. W cuts all that out and uses coffee fruit extract, which helps with the mental focus without the sharp spike and drop. It becomes part of my late night routine, recording, researching, edits, staying present when the stories get dark. If you want to try it for yourself, you can use my promo code HauntedInBetween for 10% off at checkout. Let's get the dub. The link's in the description. Now let's get back into the story. The first 48 hours of homicide investigation, that's the critical golden window, had been gone for years. The scene itself wasn't fresh. It was fossilized, and police were starting from behind. When Albuquerque police formally organized the 118th Street Task Force, they were stepping into one of the hardest kinds of investigations. A serial case with no living crime scene, no immediate timeline, no recent witnesses, no obvious forensic trails. The victims had likely been dead for years. The desert had done what deserts do. Sun, wind, animals, time. Everything that might have spoken had been worn down. Still, investigators worked aggressively. Tips poured in from the public, by the hundreds, then into thousands. Detectives interviewed women from the same streets where many of the victims had worked. They tried to identify predators, repeat customers, violent men, pimps, truck drivers, strange regulars, anyone who might have stood out. They reviewed old missing person reports, compared timelines, built victimology profiles, mapped where women were last seen, where they lived, who they knew, who had been arrested in those same areas during the relevant years. The case drew in local police, state resources, and federal support. Crime Stoppers offered a massive reward. Billboards went up, the city watched and waited, and yet, even with all of that pressure, the killer remained a ghost. Because whoever buried those women had chosen his dumping ground carefully. At the time of the murders, the Mesa sat in a strange developmental limbo. Too remote for routine discovery, too close to the city to seem suspicious if anyone drove out there. Open enough to bury bodies unnoticed. Empty enough that no one would stumble across them for years. It was a killer's blind spot, and by the time the graves were found, that advantage had matured into nightmare. Eventually, one name kept rising above the others: Lorenzo Montoya. If you line up the known facts around Montoya, it becomes easy to understand why so many investigators and observers believe he may have been the West Mesa killer. He lived less than 3 miles from the burial site. Roads connected his area to the Mesa. He was known to cruise the same Central Avenue corridors where the victims were. He had a documented history of violence against sex workers. And perhaps most chilling of all, he allegedly talked about killing women and burying them on the Mesa. That alone is enough to freeze your blood. Because if that statement is true, then the case almost sounds solved. But almost is one of the cruelest words in an unsolved crime. Montoya's violent history wasn't vague speculation. He had been arrested before involving sex workers, including attempted strangulation. Then, in December 2006, something happened that permanently changed how police viewed him. A 19-year-old sex worker named Sharika Hill went to Montoya's trailer. At some point, he bound and strangled her. But before he could dispose of her body, her boyfriend arrived, realized something terrible was happening, and fatally shot Montoya. That one incident became the hinge for an enormous theory. What if Sharika Hill's murder interrupted a pattern that had already claimed 11 women? What if the only reason the West Mesa killings stopped was because the killer himself was killed in 2006? The timeline is hard to ignore. The known West Mesa victims disappeared between 2001 and 2005. Montoya died in late 2006, and the pattern appears to stop. For many in law enforcement, that makes him the most compelling suspect. Even his method in Sharika Hill's case, strangulation, binding, attempted disposal, fits the broad shape of what may have happened to the women found on the Mesa. But here's the problem. Suspicion is not evidence. And one brutal truth in this case is that New Mexico law created a roadblock after Montoya's death, because he died before being charged in the West Mesa case. His DNA could not simply be entered and broadly compared the way investigators wanted. So the best suspect may also be the suspect the system has struggled hardest to test completely. That is infuriating for the families, and it leaves the case hanging in one of the worst possible positions. A likely name, a probable pattern, and still no official justice. Montoya was not the only man investigators scrutinized. Another deeply disturbed figure was Joseph Beale. Beale had his own horrific history. He was later convicted in a series of violent sexual assaults involving young girls, crimes that earned him the nickname the mid-school rapist. He also had a known pattern of cruising Central Avenue and soliciting women in the same environment where many West Mesa victims disappeared. At one point, police found what looked like a potentially important clue near one of the graves, a plastic tag from a nursery plant. Beale had purchased landscaping materials from a similar nursery, and when police searched deeper into his background and property, they found enough odd overlap to keep him firmly in the conversation. There were also reports that he possessed women's jewelry and undergarments not belonging to his wife, possible trophies in the minds of some investigators. Later, Blea was linked by DNA to the death of another woman, a sex worker found dead in 2004. That did not prove he was the West Mesa killer, but it did prove something else. He was absolutely capable of this kind of violence. That matters because in serial cases, police don't just look for one perfect piece of evidence. They build pressure around probability. Who was nearby? Who had the pattern? Who had access? Who had the temperament and history? Blea checked enough boxes to remain deeply suspicious. But like Montoya, he never became the case-closing answer. No direct forensic tie to the Mesa victims has publicly sealed it. So he remains another figure circling the edges of this mystery. A viable suspect, a violent man, and not enough. When a case stays unsolved long enough, theories widen. And with West Mesa, one of the more unsettling questions is whether all 11 women were killed by the same person at all. Most investigators lean towards one predator. The victims' profiles overlap, the burial site is consistent, the disappearance cluster around a specific period, the psychology feels singular. But some researchers and criminologists have considered another possibility. What if the killer had help? What if this wasn't a lone predator, but part of a larger criminal arrangement involving traffickers, pimps, or intermediaries who delivered vulnerable women into danger? Or, more disturbingly still, what if more than one violent man used the same stretch of Mesa at different times, knowing it was a good place to hide bodies? There is no strong public evidence proving any of that. Still, the case leaves enough gaps that investigators cannot comfortably rule out every layered possibility. That's what prolonged uncertainty does. It doesn't just preserve one mystery, it creates space for many. And every theory grows from the same unbearable truth. Someone repeatedly hunted women who were easy for society to overlook. Whether it was one man or more than one, the environment of vulnerability was the same. That's the larger horror here. A killer didn't need magic. He didn't need invisibility. He only needed a population that the world wasn't protecting well enough. What makes the West Mesa case so haunting isn't just the body count. It's the silence around the answers. No arrests, no confession, no courtroom, no family hearing the words, "We got him." Just 11 women unearthed from the sand and a city left to wonder whether justice died before it ever had a chance. For many people, the most likely explanation is also the most unsettling poetic. If Lorenzo Montoya truly was the West Mesa bone collector, then he was never caught by detectives. He was stopped only because one intended victim's boyfriend interrupted him and killed him first. In that version of the story, the murders ended not because the system worked, but because chance did. A random moment of intervention, a street-level act of protection. A killer brought down before police ever had the chance to prove what he had done. That possibility is both satisfying and deeply unsatisfying, because even if it's true, the families never got certainty. No conviction, no official reckoning, no final public naming of the man who took their daughters, sisters, and mothers. And if Montoya wasn't the killer, then the alternative is even more chilling, that someone else murdered those women and may have walked free all these years. The desert gave back the dead, but not the truth. Not yet. Today, the West Mesa looks quiet again. The excavation is long over, the remains have been removed, a memorial park stands where horror once lay hidden under brush and dust. Families can visit, say names, leave flowers, sit with grief, but even a memorial can't answer the question that still hangs over Albuquerque. Who did this? And why were these women left unprotected for so long? The West Mesa case is about a serial predator, but it also is about neglect, about whose disappearances get taken seriously, about who gets called troubled instead of endangered, about how easy it is for violence to hide when society has already decided some lives are expected to fall apart. These women were not disposable, not because they were perfect, not because they were easy to protect, but because they were human, and they were loved. Monica, Victoria, Syllannia, Doreen, Victoria, Jamie, Evelyn, Virginia, Julie, Cinnamon, and Michelle. The desert returned their names. The city still owes them the rest. What do you think happened on the West Mesa? Was it one predator hiding in plain sight? A violent man who blended so easily in Albuquerque's underworld that no one noticed until it was far too late? Was it Lorenzo Montoya, Joseph Blea, someone else entirely, or more than one person? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and or on social media, because every conversation keeps attention on these women. And sometimes attention is the only thing that keeps a cold case from disappearing completely. If you haven't done already, don't forget to follow Haunted in Between, like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Next week, we leave the open desert of New Mexico and head into the remote mountains of southern Oklahoma for one of the strangest family disappearances in modern true crime. A husband, a wife, a 6-year-old daughter, their truck is found abandoned on a dirt road. Inside are their phones, wallet, prescriptions, and a starving dog, and more than $2,000 in cash left behind. No signs of a struggle, no clear trail, no explanation. Years later, their skeletal remains are found miles away, but even then investigators still can't say for sure how they died. It's a case of paranoia, isolation, family tension, and unanswered questions that only get stranger the deeper you go. Come back next week for episode 9, The Jameson Family Disappearance. Remember, we are haunted in between. You're not alone. You're in between.